Now, there was no shortage of big announcements and soaring rhetoric at last week's US-led climate summit after the US, UK and Canada committed to ambitious new emission reduction goals. The Morrison government has been labelled a laggard and accused of being left behind on climate. But new analysis shows Australia's existing climate targets are among the most ambitious in the world, and we're well on the way to reaching them. For more on this, I'm joined by Director of Research at the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Daniel, the green left types will tell you Australia is embarrassing itself on the world stage with our lack of ambition on reducing emissions. Tell us why they're wrong.
They're wrong, Rita, because under the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, Australia already has committed itself to the deepest cuts to emissions on a per capita basis anywhere in the world. And that's despite the fact that Australia is a resource-intensive nation with a big coal mining sector, exports a lot of coal, and we use a lot of coal in the production of our energy. So it's just flat out wrong to say that Australia is not pulling its quote-unquote fair share when it comes to climate change. But what we also know, Rita, is at the same time China is completely unconstrained by the Paris Climate Agreement. They can increase their emissions without any boundary whatsoever. And so what has happened here is that Australia's ruling class have really taken a knee to China when it comes to climate ambitions and climate targets. It's just not in Australia's national interest to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement or be to pursuing these overtly audacious targets.
Yes, we've got a lot of useful idiots for the Chinese communist regime in this country. Now, you've had a close look at which nations are actually on track to meet their emission targets under the Paris Agreement. Of the 200 signatories to Paris, how many are doing what they promised?
Well, we can count them on two hands, Rita. There's 8. 8 out of close to 200 that are on target to meet their emissions reductions obligations. Well, according to the data, we're not quite one yet, but the kind of countries that are meeting their targets are Bhutan, Morocco, for example, and collectively they account for less than 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And so the key issue here is really climate change agreements have very little to do with emissions and everything to do with countries trying to gain a geopolitical strategic advantage against one another. And so this is the issue, is that other countries are getting a competitive economic advantage against Australia, China foremost amongst them. But again, I come back to the point, we are a resource-intensive nation. Australia, since settlement, has been built on our resources sector. That is the backbone of our culture, of our economy, and of our way of life. And so the key thing here is when we look at proposals like a net zero emissions target, we know that up to 650,000 jobs would be put at risk by that target in those sectors in agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. And that would unleash a significant humanitarian catastrophe across regional Australia. It's not the inner city types that are going to be losing their jobs. It's mainstream Australians living in the suburbs and the regions.
Oh, absolutely. And we've also seen that you don't need to be a signatory to Paris to actually reduce your emissions. Michael Schellenberger was on this program last week and he said the US has had the most dramatic reductions under the Trump administration, which withdrew out of Paris, but they still exceeded their targets for reducing emissions. Now, Judith Sloan wrote a superb piece in The Australian today, and quite simply, she makes the point China accounts for nearly a third of global emissions, and between 2015 and 2019, they built 360 new coal-fired plants. Is Beijing's talk on climate the cheapest of all? And why would Australia move to effectively decarbonise our economy when China is doing the opposite and benefiting from our natural resources?
Well, it's a great point. And just to add to that, China is currently constructing close to 100 new coal-fired power stations, whereas in Australia, we're constructing 0. And so the point to make here is that it should be up to nations themselves to determine what they want to do, and the voters of those nations. Australians have repeatedly been asked at elections. In 2013, that was a referendum on the carbon tax, and Australians said no. 2019 was dubbed by the left as the climate change election, and Australians rejected the extreme climate policies of Labor. It should be up to the public and the voters of Australia to decide what kind of emissions reduction policies we're going to have, not unelected global bureaucrats at the UN or any of these other international organisations. Scott Morrison was voted to be Prime Minister of Parramatta, not Paris.
Well, that's true, but we are seeing Scott Morrison flirt with these 2050 targets, net zero emissions. We're being told it's inevitable, that he is making all the noises that he's going to adopt a similar policy that other world leaders have adopted. What's your advice to him? Because is he getting badly advised from his inner circle? Is it pressure from the corporates? What is behind this green tinge to Scott Morrison?
Well, that's a big part of it. I think the pressure from the corporates is a big part of it. All of the commanding heights of our culture and our economy are pushing a net zero emissions target, whether it's woke banks like ANZ who won't lend to farmers because of cows emitting carbon, or whether it's sporting codes pushing this, or the universities pushing climate change. So there is an overall culture pushing towards net zero emissions. But the point I would make is that adopting a net zero emissions target would be a betrayal of the Australian people. It would be turning his back on the people that voted for him in the 2019 election. The analysis that we've undertaken found that 17 of the top 20 seats that would be hit by job losses under a net zero emissions target are held by the coalition. So adopting a net zero emissions target is going to be hitting their own voters in a way of saying thank you for getting them into government. It is a bad idea for our nation.
Absolutely. And we saw with that polling last week from Sydney Morning Herald and The Age that climate crisis is way down on the list of issues concerning the average Australian voter, and yet it seems to dominate so much of the debate. Daniel Wild, always fabulous to get your insights. Thanks for your time this evening.
Pleasure. Thank you, Rita.